This is the case study of Casper, a 12-year-old Welsh Shetland cross pony. Casper had been laminitic for a fair time, and I was called in because he was acutely painful for about 4 months, and despite his owner and the veterinarian and the hoof care provider's interventions, he was not improving. When I get called out to see a pony like this, I'm going to ask for as much documentation in advance as possible. I'd like any radiographs that are available, pictures of the animal's feet, body, living environment, etc., any blood work that's available, and details about the animal's history from the owner's perspective. Unfortunately, in Casper's case, it was the weekend, and I was being asked to go out on an emergency basis. He was quite painful, and had been painful for so long that the owner had emotionally had it. And she asked me if I could come out immediately, which I was happy to do. So because the vet clinic was closed, we didn't have any radiographs. And because the owner had a limited amount of documentation, the only thing she was able to send me in advance was his most recent blood work. This is what the blood work looked like when she forwarded it to me. And, you know, as a farrier, I'm not looking at this blood work for diagnostic purposes. The diagnosis has already been done. We know that this pony is metabolic. He has equine metabolic syndrome. In this blood panel, his ACTH was normal, although he was already on pergolide. He was on 1 tab of Presend a day. And yet his insulin was still very high despite the interventions that the team had been implementing. So for me, what I'm looking for is where are the holes that I can help the owner plug to help this animal improve. And nutrition and management are often a gray area where many veterinarians take an active role in nutrition and in management and environment, especially for these metabolic animals. Often it's left to the owner or the hoof care provider who sees the animal more often to be knowledgeable and offer recommendations. So for me, I'm immediately thinking about the fact that we need that insulin to come down and be normalized in order for the laminitis to stop. We know there's a direct connection there based on really good studies that have been done. So the first thing I'm thinking about is, you know, what am I going to see with this painful animal? How am I going to help his feet? But then what other areas can I input on to help him? And thinking about diet and management is part of that equation from the role that I have with these horses. Some healthcare providers don't want to get involved in that aspect, and that's okay. But for me, I know that what the horse is eating and how he's managed directly impacts my success with the horse's feet. So my business model, my choice, is to take a more active role. Probably has a lot to do with my personality and being detail-oriented and somewhat opinionated, and some might say controlling. Those things are well suited to micromanagement of the metabolic horse. So this was Casper when I first met him. He had had boots on all 4 feet, and he was in bedding that was about 8 inches deep. And so what was happening in the stall is he was actually very unstable. And you can see what he's doing here with his hind feet. And I was worried about there being ligament or tendon damage. I was worried about you know, maybe posturally in the stall that he was in a lot of trouble. And so for me, I was really thinking about how could I get this animal to be more comfortable and more stable. He had raging digital pulses and all 4 feet were very hot. So even though he's not incredibly uncomfortable here, you know, he's a little tentative on the turns and his feet are like hot coals. I think he's so lame in all 4 feet that he just doesn't look too bad at the moment. So we're going to focus for this case study on his hind feet because those were the ones that were quite unusual. When you look at his hind feet statically, just as they stand, this is what they looked like. And you know, typical foundered pony feet. And for me, keep in mind, I'm breaking the foot down into distortions versus pathologies. So the distortion being the state of being twisted out of natural or normal shape or position. Maybe they're a little out of control as well. And the pathology is structural and functional manifestations of a disease. So distortions are things that I can trim away, things that I can address with my work on the foot. Pathologies are often things that have to grow out or be rehabilitated. Looking at feet from the perspective of distortion versus pathology has led me to break feet into 5 distortion types. And each case study, we have to review this a little bit because it relates to what I'm looking at and how I develop a plan for the horse's foot. So your maintenance feet are your ideal feet. Ideal palmar angle is between 5 and 8 degrees. That's that bottom angle of the bone in relation to the ground. You also want a straight hoof pastern axis and a capsule that's free of flares and other asymmetries. If you have a low palmar angle foot, it's going to have different types of distortions. And if you have a high palmar angle foot, which is the palmar angle higher than 8 degrees, you're going to have different distortions and then also pathologies. The low palmar angle is also going to have pathologies being lower than 5 degrees. So I actually think of these feet as front of the foot problems and back of the foot problems. Low palmar angle feet have back of the foot problems predominantly. High palmar angle feet have front of the foot problems predominantly. So if we break down very simply what we're looking at on Casper's feet, say he wasn't painful and we didn't know that he had a diagnosis of laminitis, it might be a little challenging to figure out what to do with these feet specifically. But if I can figure out what distortions are leading me to the internal anatomy arrangement, it will give me a direction to go. And a lot of this we do intuitively, but I like to be specific and break it down so the foot doesn't trick me. So on Casper's hind feet, I'm looking at the dish to the dorsal wall, I'm looking at the shallow coronary band in relation to the ground, I'm looking at the abrupt downward turn at the heel area. I think that has to actually do with his rocking back on those heels a lot. His heels are tall and fairly underrun, but not crushed. They're upright. And then he's got the divergent hoof rings, which are wider at the heel than the toe. And when we look at that high palmar angle, chronic laminitis type of foot, those things all go with that type of foot. So I'm feeling pretty confident that my palmar angle is high because remember, I don't have a radiograph for this pony and he's doing this weird thing with his hind feet. And so I want to make sure I don't inadvertently hurt him with my plan that I'm going to implement. We can categorize these distortions and that verifies my thinking. So even though he's rocking back onto those heels, I'm still thinking about his palmar angle and his alignment being higher than I would like. And I'm thinking about how to trim him to get his capsule less distorted. We can also look at those distortions versus pathologies this way. Some people are organic learners where they can take a lot of information without it being very organized and come to a conclusion. Other people like to have things very linear and spelled out and very systematic. So this Venn diagram is here to help people who are more systematic learners who like to understand that high palmar angle distortions are these types of things in green on the left and the pathologies are in pink on the right, but sometimes they also share. So like a flat sole in front of the frog apex, well, that's a distortion, but it's also a pathology because it's related to the rotation and the bone pressing down on the sole. The dish to the dorsal wall is a distortion because it's a dish, but the pathology is because of the rotation. So there's a laminar wedge inside the dish. So keep in mind also that not all pathologies are related to foot type, but for that high palmar angle, typically the pain level of the horse will be telling. And for Casper, that was certainly the case. So what I did, because I didn't have those pre-radiographs, is I actually took an after trim radiograph that I did. The pony ended up coming to my house for rehabilitation because the owner did not have a dry lot. And that ended up being a big part of the problem, was that she didn't have a way to keep him off grass and manage him at home. So he was stuck in the stall. And I really felt like movement was important for him. So once he came to my facility, I was able to radiograph him. And what I did is I took the dorsal wall marker there, which is a 30mm wire, and I laid it on the dorsal wall of the pre-trim photo. And because of the scale markers, I knew that they were an appropriate size, the picture and the radiograph. And I aligned the scale marker, the dorsal wall marker there, with the new growth below the wall. Now this is an approximation, but what's interesting about this is we can appreciate that I was fairly accurate in my assessment that his palmar angle was high, and we can look at the fact that he's got a very, very long toe, even with the very high heel. This one, the left hind, was even worse, 27-degree palmar P3 angle. So again, this is an approximation, but it does help me to go back. As a side note, it also shows you what I trimmed off. So if you look at the foot outside of the radiograph, you can see that I took the dish down on the dorsal wall, and then I changed the plane of his sole where I lowered the heels more than I lowered the toe. But this foot was excessively long. And I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind, is that what the horse lands on first is what is functionally longer to the horse. It may not be longer in terms of room of foot, so be careful with your trimming decisions. But in terms of locomotion and articulation, whatever the horse lands on hard is sometimes in their way. So heel first landing is certainly a goal when you're watching the horse in slow motion video, on the flat, at the walk, and you want to see just that slight heel first landing. However, a hard heel first landing, or worse, what this horse is doing, rocking back onto his heels, on the back of his heels, it's because they're too long. And he's been stuck in a stall in boots on very deformable footing. So he ended up rocking back in the stall and flipping his boots up. So the sole side of the boot was facing his front legs, and that stretched his tendons. So I decided right away with this pony that I just wanted to trim him to these basic guidelines. If I start there, then I feel like I can reassess and modify away from that. So my goals were to get more of that 50-50 ratio of toe to heel support around the center of rotation. So looking at the center of his hoof capsule, I want 50% support in his toe versus 50% support in his heel. And as we saw in the approximate radiograph and photo comparison, he had 80-20 ratio, and that just was too long. I want him to have between a 5 and 8 degree palmar P3 angle and a straight hoof pastern axis. So based on that approximation, we know that the palmar angle was way too high, 16 degrees approximately in the right foot, and what was it, 26 degrees I think in the left. It was very high, so that needed to come down a lot. We wanted to have his hoof capsule realigned with the internal structures, and that goes with the straight hoof pastern axis as well. We wanted to have appropriate sole depth, and right now he had excess. He had too much vertical height, so we wanted to modify that a little bit. And then we wanted to look at that medial lateral balance in 3D, but this horse's problem was not his medial lateral balance. This horse's problem was his AP balance, or his dorsal palmar balance, that palmar P3 angle. This horse had been very, very difficult for the previous hoof care provider to trim, and that may have been part of the problem. They wondered if he had an injury to his hind end at some point. He would pick a hind foot up and then slam it down. We know those horses. So I use an angle grinder with these guys especially, and he tolerated that very well, and I was able to get a pretty decent trim on him for the first trim. I was a little conservative just because I didn't have the radiograph, but I was able to improve him a lot, and I knew that he was coming to my facility, so I knew that I'd have an opportunity to trim him again fairly quickly. So this was after the first trim. We did put his boots on the front feet just to try to keep him as comfortable as possible, and you can see that already he's landing much more solid in those hind feet. He's not rocking back anymore. You know, he's still toe flipping a little bit, but I would expect that given how hyperextended his tendons were in the wrong position. So we brought him here to Daisy Haven Farm. He got movement, and he certainly started moving better. You can see he's still stiff behind, but he is landing much flatter. So I was pretty happy with that. And even barefoot on the pavement, I feel like he's just moving more freely forward. And this gave me an opportunity to assess him out of the stall, get him moving, and even just that was already a great improvement. These are his hind feet after his second trim. I did radiograph him at this point, so I knew that I was meeting my goals. And this is what the right hind looked like. So we still had plenty of vertical depth, and you know, his hoof pastern axis is fairly straight. He's at a 6-degree palmar angle, and I've got him to a 60-40 ratio of balance around the COR, that center of rotation of the hoof capsule. So I'm pretty happy with that. And the left hind, he has a 9-degree palmar angle, so that one needed to come down just a little bit more, but again, we were much, much closer to our goals. So even though this situation seemed really complicated, it actually resolved fairly well just by getting a more balanced trim on his foot. I actually had the opportunity to talk to the previous Hoofcare provider, and I asked him why he had left his heels so long. That first video, he had actually been trimmed by the previous Hoofcare provider 5 days before. So it wasn't like he was overdue, and it wasn't like he was you know, just extra long. He had just been seen by the previous farrier. So when I talked to him, his answer was that he had a tendency to go caudally rotated, to have a palmar P3 angle that's low or negative in the hind feet. And so he was leaving heel to help him get more upright. And he didn't see a correlation between the high heel and the toe flipping. And I told him what I had done, and he found that very interesting, and maybe he learned something from that. But, you know, he just had a different idea in his mind about what was going on. So 2 weeks after the new diet at our facility, we let him move around. We gave him free choice access to an appropriate amount of hay in a slow feed net, so it would last him 24 hours. We test our hay so we know that it's low enough in ESC plus starch. And we also give them Timothy pellets with a mineral balancer that is considered safe with no added iron, and flaxseed and vitamin E, and also a little bit of iodized salt. And so he had been on this diet for 2 weeks. He had been moving around more, and already his insulin had come down to a much lower number, 78 rather than over 200. So we felt pretty good about that. However, sometimes we find that the GI ratio, the glucose to insulin ratio, is very helpful. So there are basically 2 types of insulin resistance, and there's compensated and uncompensated, and they're slightly different, and some veterinarians find this information helpful, and some don't feel that it's relevant at all. This is information that's adapted from people, and yet every time I've ignored the GI ratio, I've regretted it, because sometimes our blood work can be normal, meaning the insulin and the ACTH and all those numbers can actually be in the normal ranges, but the animal is still in trouble. And for Casper, even though his number was coming down, I just wanted to critically assess where he was at. So for him, his GI ratio showed that he was uncompensated, which is fairly rare in horses. According to Dr. Barb Crabb, she wrote a nice article on this in Horse and Rider, which I've referenced here, to explain compensated versus uncompensated. But you can see, if we look at these numbers based on the GI ratio, the risky calculation, and the MIRG, this comes from the ECIR, Equine Cushing's and Insulin Resistant IR calculator. It shows that he's still in trouble. And what I find is a lot of these ponies, once they start feeling better, the owner and the team back off the critical care for the animal. And so for me, I'm looking at this going, well, his insulin's come down, but it's not normal yet. We're going to keep doing what we're doing. And the GI ratio shows that we're still in trouble, so we're going to keep this pony on a tight regimen plan. This is what he looked like after his second trim. We had him out of boots. He was living in a dry lot where he could move. This was his paddock at Daisy Haven Farm. And he's feeling pretty good at this point. I was very surprised. These trims were probably 2 weeks apart. So the first visit, came to Daisy Haven Farm and immediately got a second trim. And then this last trim was 2 weeks later. So I had tried to get his feet back as quickly as possible while letting him adjust a little bit. And you can see that he's moving much more freely, willing to load his front feet, not so awkward and stiff behind. So we did new blood work about a month later, and his insulin is now normal, although here's where that GI ratio really becomes relevant. You can see from the GI ratio that it's showing that he's still uncompensated IR. His risky is poorly compensated, and his MIRG is high insulin responder. So all that's telling me is that I need to keep this pony on a really tight management plan. And when the blood work normalizes and this pony's ready to go home, a lot of times the owners see the normalized blood work and they think the animal's all better. But we have to remember that laminitis, especially metabolic laminitis, is a disease of prevention, meaning that the best intervention we have is to prevent it from ever happening. So I use that GI ratio and I talk to my vets and I say, listen, I don't know how much relevancy this actually has to horses, but what I do know is that if it motivates the owner to keep the animal on a tight management plan, then that to me is beneficial. So I like to provide that information to the owner. And usually the vets are okay in that context, because the last thing that I want to do is be seen as diagnosing or undermining my veterinarian in any way. So I always talk to my veterinarian first before I would give this kind of information to the owner. And I'm very clear with them about the relevancy. You know, this is something that I tend to look at. It's helpful to me in terms of understanding how much risk is this animal at. And we can go by phenotype, you know, but Casper had been losing weight and he wasn't that obese to begin with. So I think he just was a sensitive pony and still is. So this is Casper today. He is happy. He has been adopted by one of my other owners. The previous owner could no longer keep him because she couldn't figure out a dry lot for him. And so he was adopted by this wonderful owner who already had dry lot situation, was already managing her horses in an appropriate way for Casper. And so he was an easy fit into their herd. And I'll be able to continue with his hoof care, and I'm very happy that he has this safe landing place so that he can be healthy long term. So thank you for joining me for Casper's case study. I hope it was interesting to you. We've talked about a lot of different things, and we'll go more in depth on all those things in future case studies and future posts in the blog. If you're interested in any hands-on workshops, or if I can help you in any way, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always available to give you input or help, and I just appreciate you all being here. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.